Hello everyone, and welcome back to another fun-filled episode of TDNY. This day, not year. The podcast that looks back at the history of the week ahead. Now, when I say fun-filled, your mileage may vary, as we're back with another deadly, explosion-laden, classic TDNY episode. Which, this week, we'll be learning. When haggling turned deadly. Who armed the FBI? How people were dying for a deep-sea adventure? And what's in the name Nickelodeon? Plus a whole lot more along the way. Of course, we also have our usual music pairing for each story, as well as the dreaded quiz at the end of the episode, just to see how much you've retained along the way. So, let's get things started with Monday, June 16th. On this day, not year, a sailor is dying to meet the locals. Today we are back in Canada, just off Vancouver Island. When last we visited this particular part of the world, it was to witness a ripple rock meeting its end in an explosive fashion. So why bother fighting tradition? Our explosive target of choice today isn't a rock, but a ship, the Tonquin. Launched in 1807, it was an American-owned merchant ship, weighing in at 290 tons, 29 meters or 96 feet long, and boasting a trio of masts and 10 cannons. It started life trading between China, then Fiji, and after a change in owner, found itself in the fur trade. Specifically, the John Jacob Astor owned Pacific Fur Company that only had one thing on their minds: beaver. Beaver pelts, that is. The pelts were used as material to make European-styled hats, as the fur was longer-lasting and held its shape better than other materials. So long-lasting was the fur that it wasn't uncommon for the hats to be passed down from father to son, and it's no wonder they looked after them. In the 1600s, the cost of one beaver hat was the equivalent of 2 months' worth of wages, while 1770 had them at twice the normal weekly wage of an unskilled labourer. And in New York in 1825, they were $5 to $8. Demand was still strong in 1811, the year we find ourselves in currently, but only a few decades later would see it fade drastically, with prices fallen from $6 and $8 per pound to $1, as silk became the dome-donning material of choice. Captain Jonathan Thorne was in charge of the ship. He had 2 missions. 1. Set up a fur trading post at the mouth of the Columbia River in Northwest America. And 2. Trade for fur among the indigenous occupants of the area and the surrounding lands and islands. Thorne lived up to his name, and was prickly by nature, described as having a quick temper, little imagination, and being quite inflexible. Gabriel Francher, a fur trader who once sailed with Thorne, described him as a strict disciplinarian of a quick and passionate temper, accustomed to exact obedience, considering nothing but duty, and giving himself no trouble about the murmurs of his crew, taking counsel of nobody. I think my accent was a bit all over then. When attempting to navigate the mouth of the Columbia River, Captain Thorne, over the course of a couple of days, sent out 3 expeditions to chart the fast-flowing and unpredictable waters. 1 boat of sailors vanished entirely. Another only just made it out alive, while a third, despite surviving and returning to the Tonquin, weren't picked up, as Thorne was too preoccupied with other matters. In total, 8 needlessly died following the captain's orders. they wouldn't be the last aboard the Tonquin killed by Captain Thorne's actions. Several months were spent setting up Fort Astoria, the trading post, and much of the crew and passengers stayed behind to manage that. When the Tonquin set off again, it was as a crew of 23, although other reports say as many as 29. They had with them a local interpreter, who either went by Hosachow, Lamazey, or George, a man with supposed relations in the nearby islands who could translate and advise. June 14th. The Tonquin docks just off Clayoquot Sound at a place known as Woody Point, and welcomes aboard members of the Clayoquot tribe, while the cargo master goes ashore to visit them. On board the ship, the tribe's sub-chief, a respected elder, attempts to haggle with Captain Thorne over the price of the pelts. He feels Thorne can provide more than he's giving, while Thorne, once decided on something, isn't one to change his mind. It's claimed the tribesman made a joke at Thorne's expense, who, believe it or not, wasn't great at being humbled. Captain Thorne threw a pelt in the tribesman's face and had him thrown overboard, the rest of the tribe scrambling off the Tonquin after him. That night, tensions were high as Josachow Lamazey George and the cargo master warn of a reprisal attack over Captain Thorne's actions. But Thorne was convinced their superior firepower, 10 cannons and firearms, would keep them safe. The night remained quiet. As the sun rose on the 15th, a boat of tribesmen approached the Tonquin, bringing with them pelts for trade. They are let on board. Over the course of the morning, more and more of the Clayoquot tribe arrive and board the Tonquin for trade. They are more susceptible to a deal now, much to Captain Thorne's delight. The only thorn in his side is their demand for knives and axes in the trade. But this is a concession to which he is willing to turn a blind eye. Until one of the crew quietly points out to him, not only are they now outnumbered on board, they've just armed all the tribesmen. Sure enough, the Clayoquot tribe attacked. They massacred the men of the Tonquin, taking many of them by surprise. Captain Thorne, according to one survivor, wasn't able to use his superior firepower, instead putting up some resistance with a knife of his own, taking some attackers down before succumbing to numbers and a club to the back of the head. As the Tonquin crew lay dead or dying, the Clayoquot tribe retreated back to shore, unaware of the survivors, overlooked in the ship's rigging. At least according to one version of the story anyway. Another had 4 of the surviving crew, heroically fighting their way to the ship's weapons lockers and clearing the deck of attackers with shot. But regardless of how, the Tonquin had 5 survivors. Hosachow Lamazey George and 4 other crew members, although one was slowly dying. It was the dying crew member, James Lewis, who told the others to take one of the rowboats and sneak off in the dead of night. He would stay behind and provide a distraction. They just had to do one thing for him first. The morning of June 16th arrived. The ship was empty now, but for the dying James Lewis, it wouldn't be empty for long. It still contained all of its treasures, the trade goods Captain Thorne had offered, personal items, firearms, other weapons, and, of course, barrels and barrels of gunpowder. An estimated 4 tons of the stuff. As James waited below deck, he heard the tribe return, listened as the first people boarded the ship, then as more and more boarded and began searching. First 10, then 20, 30, 50, an estimated 80 to 200 Clayoquot had boarded the Tonquin to loot their prize. It was then that James ignited the line of gunpowder his 4 crew members had laid out for him. All those on board were killed, while many of those on boarding vessels were also caught in the blast, dying or suffering devastating injury. James had more than gotten revenge, which was terrible news for the 4 survivors, crashing ashore in the night and being taken as prisoners. 3 of the remaining crew were tortured and eventually killed, reprisal for James's actions. It was only Josachel Lamazee George who survived the ordeal, the lone survivor, all because a captain didn't want to compromise while bargaining over animal pelts. Months had gone by at Fort Astoria, and the missing Tonquin was a cause of constant concern. Rumours from up north had spread word of a massacre and an exploded ship. It wasn't until Josachel Lamazee George finally made his way back to the fort that the loss of the Tonquin was confirmed. My song pairing for this story is Leave Her Johnny by Nathan Evans. While not a song about the Tonquin, perhaps the sentiments found in the song were felt by those sailing under Captain Thorne. Tuesday, June 17th. On this day, not year, a career criminal changes the law. Here's a hypothetical for you. If you were a fugitive in 1920s America, and 2 FBI agents, or Bureau of Investigation agents as they were back then, approached you, what would you do? Hopefully you didn't overreact, as agents back then not only didn't carry weapons, they weren't allowed to detain suspects either. All that would change, however, thanks to one man, Frank Jellybean Nash. Frank was born 6th of February 1887 in Indiana, United States. His nickname, Jellybean, was given due to his well-groomed appearance, which I can only assume means he overdid it on the hair gel, and his pate ended up looking more like a Lego hairpiece, or a jelly bean. An article in an Australian newspaper, published after his death, described him as a tall, slope-shouldered fellow with a big nose, thinning hair, and ingratiating grin. Frank ended up in jail in 1913 after murdering a partner in crime, as the partner was burying money to hide it on Frank's insistence. The shot going through the partner's temple and out the eye, blinding him, but leaving him alive long enough to tell the police everything. Despite a life sentence for the murder, he was soon out again. World War I had broken out, and in 1918, Frank exchanged life in prison for military life and meeting interesting new people and killing them. He found himself in France as the war ended later that year. Back in America, a free man once again, Frank went back to a life of crime and gained a new nickname, now going by just Jelly, on account of his skills for safecracking using gel-ignite explosives. While Willie the Face Sutton, from episode 8, may have been prolific in his bank-robbing spree, with an estimated 100 robberies over his lifetime, Frank Jelly Nash put that to shame, as today people credit him with 200 robberies, 42 of them done over just a 2-year span. This wasn't the only similarity Frank had with Sutton, as they were both in and out of jail, often on their own discretion. In 1924, Frank was arrested for a train robbery he had pulled on the Katy the year prior, and was sentenced to 25 years. However, over the next several years in prison, he worked his way up to becoming the warden's personal chef, and one day was tasked to run an errand outside of the prison, probably being told to pinky promise he'd return. Surprisingly, he never did. Instead, Frank ran off to Chicago, the city of Al Capone, fell in love, despite a possible 2 other wives already, continued his crime spree, which now included bigamy, I guess, and eventually found himself settling down in Hot Springs, Arkansas. Hot Springs, in the 1930s, was akin to Star Wars' Mos Eisley, a wretched hive of scum and villainy. Gambling was king, politicians were corrupt, prostitutes were plenty, and the cops that weren't crooked soon weren't breathing either. For Frank Nash, it was a paradise, but one that wouldn't last. June 1933. 2 FBI agents were tipped off that Frank Nash, now going by the alias Doc Williams, was in Hot Springs, and together with a police chief, Agents Lackey and Smith made their way to the city. Frank wasn't hard to find. He was often found drinking at the local cigar store. So when 3 men entered to purchase cigars, it's likely Frank thought nothing was wrong, until he felt the revolver at his back and was urged into a waiting car. Supposedly, his capture was so sudden that it was reported to local police as a kidnapping, not an arrest. The 4 men, the 2 FBI agents, 1 police chief, and now Frank Nash, drove to the nearest train station and took the overnighter to Kansas City. They weren't the only convoy heading towards the City of Fountains, however. Word had spread of Frank's arrest. June 17th. The train pulled into Union Station Plaza a little after 7 a.m., and Agent Lackey left to meet with the other agents and police officers waiting for them, bringing them up to a total of 8. 4 members of the FBI, 3 in the police, 2 cars waiting outside, and 1 prisoner for transport. Given the all clear, the handcuffed Frank was led into the back of one of the cars. And that's when the event that has since been named the Kansas City Massacre occurred. It's hard to say what happened first. Either Frank raised his hands as a signal, or he was raising them in surrender, as 2 men with guns stepped out from behind a car, commanding, "Up, up, get your hands up," while another voiced, "Let 'em have it," and opened fire. A 3rd shooter opened up on the gathered law enforcement too. The police chief, seated in the car, was killed. The 2 other police officers fell moments later, as did one of the FBI agents. Smith and Lackey, also in the car, ducked down, Lackey getting hit but surviving, while Smith remained uninjured. The same couldn't be said for Frank Nash. As per the New York Times, a burst of machine gun fire on the Union Station Plaza in an ambush attempt to free an outlaw from the custody of 7 officers here today killed the prisoner and 4 of the officials and wounded 2 others. The sounds lasted only a few seconds, mown down like grain in a field. The handcuffed prisoner and the guards were all prostrate. The gunners leapt into their car and sped away. While the FBI maintained the ambush was an attempt to free Frank, this has never been confirmed. Their number 1 suspect in the attack, Charles Pretty Boy Floyd, had been making a beeline towards Kansas City, stealing cars, kidnapping sheriffs, and abducting civilians along the way. While he was definitely in the city at the time of the attack, he wasn't seen again until he was gunned down a year later, and had claimed no involvement in the Kansas City Massacre up to his dying breath. The massacre was a wake-up call for the FBI. They were walking into fights unarmed. This would change, as per the FBI.gov website, in an article covering the Kansas City Massacre. Within a year of the tragedy, Congress responded by giving us new tools to fight crime, including statutory authority to carry guns and make arrests. Zip Gun Bop by Royal Crown Revue is my pairing for this story. A perfect pairing of gangster swing and the message of avoiding bullets with a 2-step, instead of ending up like poor Frank Nash. Wednesday, June 18th. On this day, not year, the world collectively held their breath. Imagine for me, if you will, you're lying on the floor of a minivan. 4 others are strewn about the interior too. It's dark. No lights inside and no light outside. You can't see anything or anyone. You can hear the metal around you, creaking and groaning, sounding like a gunshot. You can hear the silence from the others after every sound. You lay still, trying to control your breathing. You have limited oxygen, only enough for 96 hours, and you need to conserve it as long as you can. But the cold from outside is creeping in. As you lay on the floor, you're getting colder and colder as your body temperature leaches away, and soon you can't stop shivering. This was the image the media presented June 18th, 2023. But not for 5 people trapped in a minivan, but something else entirely. Richard Stockton Rush III was born March 31st, 1962. As a kid, he had lofty goals, wanting to be the first person on Mars. And as he grew up, he kept that pioneering spirit, being employed as a flight test engineer and even building his own private airplane. However, Richard soon stopped looking up and instead set his sights on a new frontier, the ocean, stating, "I didn't want to go up into space as a tourist. I wanted to be Captain Kirk on the Enterprise. I wanted to explore." And while space is the final frontier, the deep ocean is the last great unexplored part of our planet. In 2009, Richard Stockton Rush founded the company that would allow him to be his own Captain Kirk, OceanGate. The idea was to open the oceans for all of humanity, or at least those with enough disposable income to pay for it, as initial trips cost between $7,500 to $40,000 per person, depending on the dive location, with the final trips OceanGate took costing up to $250,000 per person. While the original plan was to build a fleet of submersibles, the first 2 were second-hand. Antipodes was built in 1973 and was only capable of diving to a depth of 305 meters or 1,000 feet. The Cyclops 1, originally intending to be OceanGate's first constructed sub, instead was built around a 12-year-old second-hand frame and was capable of reaching a depth of 500 meters or 1,640 feet. Sticking to Greek mythology, the third sub was the first custom-built for OceanGate and was named Titan, after the mythological pre-god figures known for their strength. And strength was what was needed, as the Titan wasn't just going down to 500 meters. Stockton Rush wanted the Titan to reach down to 4,000 meters, or 13,000 feet, down to the depth of the Titanic. The Titan was custom-built, using new technologies that hadn't been implemented in reusable submarines capable of reaching those depths. Stockton quoted as saying, "We are developing technologies and designing submersibles and infrastructure that is making underwater exploration more accessible than ever before." To save on weight, allowing for more people to be transported at once, the Titan was moving away from the traditional steel and titanium shell and instead using carbon fiber. Described by innovativecomposite.com as 5 times stronger than steel and twice as stiff. The only issue was, carbon fiber hadn't been as rigorously tested as steel and titanium, and a lot of its strength came from tension rather than the compression which would be found at depth in the ocean. Despite the lack of real-world testing, diversion from industry standards, and many requirements from partners and sponsors being ignored, Rush was happy with the result stating, "You know, at some point, safety is just pure waste. I think I can do this just as safely by breaking the rules." Then, in 2018, the Titan was taken out for a test, reaching a depth of 4,000 meters. This deep dive is a major milestone for OceanGate. Not only does it mean that Titan is prepared for our upcoming 2019 Titanic survey expedition, but it also validates our innovative engineering and the repeated use of our carbon fiber. So, the Titan, OceanGate, and Rush began diving. After 3 years, the Titan needed a refit of the carbon fiber hull, after only reaching Titanic depth 3 times. But was back in business soon after, performing 10 dives down to Titanic with paying customers. On dive 80, a loud bang was heard from the hull as it returned to the surface, but testing seemed to show all was a-okay, and it kept diving. Which brings us to dive 88. What would be the 14th deep dive down to the Titanic. 3 customers had paid $250,000 each for the experience, while a French Titanic expert was also aboard, with Rush at the onboard controls, a Logitech Bluetooth video game controller. June 18th, 2023. The Titan and its crew of 5 are launched down into the North Atlantic Ocean, their support vessel, the Polar Prince, monitoring from above. Then, at 10:47 a.m., a bassy bang is heard reverberating from the depths, described as sounding like a door slamming. Wendy Rush, Stockton's wife, looks around asking, "What was that bang?" but gets no answer, as a few seconds later a message arrives from Titan, stating they had dropped 2 weights. Contact with the Titan is lost after this, but this hadn't been the first time this had happened. Then, as the hours dragged on, the worry began to set in. The sub had been set to resurface by 4:30 p.m., and when it still hadn't appeared, 3 hours after this time, the Coast Guard were called in, and the media became aware of the situation. Signs of life, hopes mounting for breakthrough in search for missing Titan sub. One headline from the 20th of June 2023 reads, "Missing Titan sub's air supply dwindling as search yields no results." Reads another, while the ABC reported, "Rescuers racing against time to find missing passengers of Titanic wreck mission." While these headlines seem to offer some hope, behind the scenes the tragedy of what had happened was already well known. Navy monitoring stations had picked up on sounds of an implosion at 10:47 a.m. on June 18th. The loud bang heard aboard the Polar Prince was the noise of the implosion, so loud it was audible from over 3 kilometers below the ocean surface. Fortunately for those aboard the Titan, it was literally over before they knew it had happened. Humans, on average, take 250 milliseconds to react to something. Longer if you haven't had your morning cuppa yet. It takes slightly less time for our vision to catch up to the world, about 100 milliseconds, as signals travel from the eye to the brain, which is why some people say we're technically living in the past. The Titan, according to studies, took maybe between 1 to 10 milliseconds to go from a functioning, if not poorly designed, submarine to an imploded wreck, compressing the air and the occupants so quickly that, according to some armchair scientists, temperatures may have spiked over 1,000 degrees Celsius or 1,830 Fahrenheit very briefly. Despite what the media had claimed, this wasn't a rescue mission. While OceanGate still exists today, they have ceased all operations. Sounding more like a New Age hymn, with lyrics, "There's a lamb being led to the slaughter, and my soul it will drown," Mishkin Fitzgerald's 2017 song, Deep in the Water, is fitting for this pairing in both tone and lyrics. Thursday, June 19th. On this day, not year, a real nickel show was put on. If you grew up in the 90s, you're likely familiar with shows like SpongeBob SquarePants, Rugrats, Hey Arnold, Avatar: The Last Airbender, The Wild Thornberrys, and The Angry Beavers, just to name a few. All of these shows have something very particular in common, besides being animated. Any guesses? I'll give you a couple of seconds here. Skip back 15 if you want to hear the list again. Well, have you got an answer? If so, you're just in the nick of time. All these shows aired on and were produced by Nickelodeon. The network first started broadcasting April 1st, 1979, created by Vivian Horner, who had previously worked for PBS, the company behind Sesame Street. While Vivian had the idea for a new network, one she wanted filled entirely with programming for children, she was stuck on a name for it. Vivian took suggestions from other colleagues, one of which was Sandy Kavanagh, who recalled, "Everybody was suffering over what to call it. I came up with a list and Nickelodeon was my favourite." It was also the name that stuck. Although, did you know, this name wasn't original. Breaking it down, nickel, as in the currency worth 5 cents, and Odeon, an ancient Greek word for a building in which shows, such as music, theatre, plays, etc., were held. So essentially, Nickelodeon is the paid fee into a theatre. A fitting name for the pay-to-view channel that it was. But like I said, the name wasn't new. For the real first Nickelodeon, we need to go back to 1888, the year of Jack the Ripper, the first driving license, and the patent for the Kodak camera. It was also an era when movies were starting to take off, and people needed somewhere to watch them. The idea of movie theatres was only just beginning, far from the multi-billion-dollar industry we know today. The origins were more often than not found in vaudeville shows, or the peep show kinetoscope, machines invented by Thomas Edison. The first Nickelodeon was opened by Colonel William Austin in Boston, Massachusetts, with the creatively named Austin's Nickelodeon. It was located, as per the 1889 King's Handbook of Boston, at number 11 Court Street, a location that would later go on to house Boston's first skyscraper. Austin's Nickelodeon was a dime museum, a place that, as per Wikipedia, was used to display freak show performers, human anatomy exhibitions, diorama oddities, and more lectures to the general public. While this may have been the first Nickelodeon, it wasn't the one that made the word known. For that, we jump to June 19th, 1905. It was the opening of the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania Nickelodeon, started by Harry Davis. Born in England, moved to America at 9, and went from being a carnival hustler to a dime museum owner, and his brother-in-law, John P. Harris. Despite only having seating for 96, 450 people lined up on opening night, drawn in by the bright lights of the building and the calls of the employees, beckoning passerbys to part with a nickel. Once inside, the Pittsburgh Nickelodeon presented itself as a classy venue, one of opulence, full of gold furnishings, paintings, statues, and other embellishments to embody a more sophisticated taste. Of course, all these touches had been made on the cheap, but that didn't detract. After the opening night, the Nickelodeon saw an estimated 7,000 patrons a day visit from the 8 a.m. opening to the midnight closing. While this wasn't the first Nickelodeon, or even the first place to show moving pictures, it was, however, the first location solely dedicated to it. No freak show exhibits, no curios, just pure movie. The showmanship presented by Davis, the building itself, and the ever-changing reel of movies shown have led some historians to consider this the birth of the first modern cinema. As per a 1909 newspaper article from London, it wouldn't be the last either. In America, there are now at least 6,000 Nickelodeons, as they are called across the Atlantic. 4 years ago, there was not one. It wasn't long after that bigger businesses took an interest in Nickelodeons, opened their own theatres with capacity for a larger audience, started charging more, and showing more impressive movies, thus driving the once innovative Nickelodeons out. This is the first recommendation, I think, of one of my top-played artists from 2024, Fish in a Birdcage. I'm pairing this story with their song Rule Number 16, Movies. Friday, June 20th. On this day, not year, we go from the birth of cinema to the first blockbuster. Diving straight in, what do you think of when I say summer blockbuster? The more recent Marvel Cinematic Universe offerings, perhaps? Star Wars or Indiana Jones? Something animated like Shrek or The Lion King, maybe? All are valid answers, but there's one that kicked them all off. The first summer blockbuster that not only had an impact on the cinema, but real-world consequences too. Based on a book written by Peter Benchley, while the name is now iconic, it was only chosen shortly before release. Working titles included The Stillness in the Water, or Leviathan Rising, or, at the suggestion of the author's father, What's that thing noshing on my leg? Finally, with time nearly out, Peter said, Why don't we call the bloody thing Jaws? And the rest is history. Which is what this podcast is all about discussing, so let's crack on. The novel was released in February 1974. Then, a year and a half later, the Steven Spielberg-directed movie was released, on this day, June 20th, making it the 50th anniversary of the movie this year. Happy birthday! And as great white sharks can live up to 70 years, it's conceivable that Bruce could have been still happily swimming about, chomping on swimmers, if it weren't for an ill-placed oxygen tank. Spoilers. The lead-up to Jaws, the movie, was a cinematic first, in that it was the first movie to have a marketing campaign, from television commercials and teasers, to radio spots featuring the iconic theme and a voiceover of, See it before you go swimming. Plus merchandise and a whole range of other Jaws-themed tat. While all this seems so common and expected today, back in 1975 it was unheard of. And it worked. People wanted to see this movie. And rather than getting it out to more theatres around America, they did the opposite. Reduced its run, creating more sensation as people had to line up, queuing outside the cinema to get a ticket. Which again, didn't put people off. According to IMDb.com, 67 million Americans, a third of the country at the time, saw the movie during its run, making $476 million at the box office, off its $9 million budget. It became, at the time, the highest-grossing film of all time, being the first movie to earn $100 million, and changed cinema releases and marketing ever after. Prior to Jaws, Summer was that time of year that studios released movies they weren't confident in, ones they knew wouldn't do well, as summer was the least profitable season for movies. The public was spending their time outside and didn't want to waste time or money at the movies. Originally, Jaws was aiming for a Christmas release in 1974, but the shoot was full of dueling actors, reshoots, and technical errors and problems. Bruce, the name of the shark, only had 4 minutes of film time in the movie, building tension as an unseen presence, an entity just out of sight, but always on mind. And, as masterful a director as Spielberg is, this was entirely accidental. The multiple props of Bruce had constant failures, one outright sinking during filming, and due to this, Bruce ended up in less and less scenes, with less of the animatronic shark being shown than originally intended. So, as the hopes for a 1974 release swam away, and the dreaded summer release was upon them, marketing needed to be in full swing to get paying customers in seats. Earlier, I stated that Jaws didn't just change cinema. Unfortunately, it also changed a lot of public perception around sharks. The Jaws effect, as it has been dubbed, is described by ScienceDaily.com as a known phenomenon where people are excessively and irrationally scared of sharks. While Dr. Christopher Pepperneff, a social scientist, describes the effect as when you use a reference from a movie to explain a real-life event. In reality, the vast majority of us haven't encountered a shark in real life, with a lot of our knowledge coming from movies like Jaws, in which science and facts take a back seat for frights and tension. I'm not saying prior to Jaws humans and sharks lived in perfect harmony, but take this 1919 newspaper article from a Sydney paper as an example. "Shark! Shark!" the headline reads, detailing the cries that went up from a Bondi beach as a fin was seen in the water, until a small boy, in a V costume and a little singlet hanging over his shoulders by a piece of tape, hurried to the scene. "Where's the shark, mister?" he said as the crowd pointed to the fin in the water. The young boy responded, "Why, it's only a pup," as he hitched the tape over his shoulder. Before anybody could stop him, he was in the water, making towards the fish. While post-Jaws, any shark, no matter species or size, was seen as a danger, with them often being targeted and killed by trophy hunters, or as an attempt to avert danger to swimmers. While Jaws may have broken viewing records at the time, and inadvertently damaged the shark's reputation for generations, my song pairing for this story has more views than Jaws, and may have damaged a whole generation of humans too. The lyrics to this song sending chills up more adult spines than anything John Williams could ever hope to write. My pairing for this story is Baby Shark by Pingfong. Saturday, June 21st. On this day, not year, Geronimo! Have you ever wondered why skydivers shouted that out prior to jumping? Well, as it's tangential to our fact for today, let's delve into it quickly. Supposedly, it dates back to the 1940s, when the idea of paratroopers was being tested. The American platoon up first to test the parachute were feeling nervous the night before their big jump. So, as the story goes, they went out and saw a movie to take their minds off it. The movie they saw was the 1939 western Geronimo, The Story of a Great Enemy. On their way home, the platoon were teasing a young private, saying he'd be so scared during the jump he wouldn't even remember his own name. To which he replied, "All right, damn it, I tell you jokers what I'm gonna do. To prove to you that I'm not scared out of my wits, when I jump, I'm gonna yell Geronimo loud as hell when I go out that door tomorrow." What these would-be paratroopers didn't know was that not only was parachuting a lot safer than it once was, it was also thanks to the daring antics of a 4-foot, 8-inch girl by the name of Tiny Broadwick. Born Georgia Ann Thompson in 1893, she was nicknamed Tiny from birth, as she weighed just 3 pounds or 1.3 kilograms, and it was a name she, didn't grow into. But, much like the 90s animated Madeline, Tiny Thompson was tough. She grew up as a self-professed tomboy. Her favourite pastime was climbing trees. "I well remember a very tall tree in our backyard that I used to climb, just to get away from everything and everybody. I could climb up into the very top and could imagine what it would be like to soar even higher." Unfortunately, just like with Jerry Fredericks Mock, the first woman to fly solo around the world from episode 14, Tiny's dreams came crashing down with marriage and her first child. Only in a much creepier way. Married at age 12, she had her first child at age 13, with her husband abandoning the young family shortly after, although apparently some sources have him dying too. Tiny spent her early teens looking after her child and working 12-hour shifts with her father to earn a measly pay. In 1908, at age 15, Tiny Thompson went off to a carnival, where she witnessed something that would change her life and her name. Charles Broadwick and his world-famous aeronauts were performing. A daring troupe who would fly into the sky on a hot air balloon, hanging beneath off a trapeze, before jumping off, parachuting safely down. Parachutes had been around since the late 1700s. You'll remember from the last episode that hot air balloons were also invented around that time. But it would take another 12 years from 1785, when Jean-François Pilatre de Rosier died, before someone combined the two, with André Jacques Garnerin becoming the first parachutist from a hot air balloon. Tiny Thompson was entranced by the display, perhaps remembering her childhood wish of wanting to soar even higher. She left her life behind, her parents looking after her child, as she ran away and joined Charles and his aeronauts. Now, the self-professed tomboy was billed as the Doll Girl, donning a costume of ruffled bloomers, silk dresses, ribbons, and a bonnet. A name and a costume she despised, but she loved the act, describing it as the most wonderful sensation in the world. As Tiny Thompson travelled with Broadwick, a man easily double her own age, he adopted her, legally, to stop any scandalous rumours about the pair, and Tiny Thompson became Tiny Broadwick. As they continued to travel, Tiny met a flying stuntman named Glenn L. Martin, and it wasn't long before she was parachuting from planes instead of balloons. On June 21st, 1913, above the skies of Los Angeles, many websites report she became the first woman to parachute from an airplane, landing safely in a nearby barley field. At the time, many reported she was even the first person to have performed such a stunt. But not only had someone beaten her to this feat, she had even possibly beaten herself. While the internet widely claims June 21st, 1913 as her first jump, one now shuttered URL, displaying only a Korean casino page, when accessed through the Wayback Machine on Internet Archive, claims that Tiny made her first jump in 1912 at the Grand Park Meet of Chicago. In either case, she was one of the leading experts on parachuting from planes, which is likely why, in 1914, as World War I was beginning, the United States Army asked her for a demonstration. She performed multiple jumps for the Army officials, demonstrating how the parachute, or lifeboat, opened, as a string attached to the plane pulled it open automatically. Only, on her fourth jump, the string got tangled, and Tiny was being dragged behind the plane by the string. She was able to cut it away and manually pull what remained, opening the parachute, not only saving her life, but also performing the first skydive with a ripcord parachute. Ultimately, her demonstrations weren't persuasive enough, stating later in life, they wouldn't give parachutes to their pilots because they were afraid the men would abandon the planes. Do you know, honey, that thousands of men were killed because of that? By age 29, Tiny Broadwick gave up parachuting, the impacts from over 1,100 jumps becoming too much of a strain on her body. She passed away in 1978 at the age of 85. A sign near her grave reading, Tiny Broadwick, Aviation Pioneer. First woman to parachute from an airplane in 1913. Demonstrated use of parachutes to Army, 1914. My song pairing came to me on the radio as I was researching for this story. Tom Petty blasting out, I'm learning to fly, but I ain't got wings. Coming down is the hardest thing. And it was an excellent fit. So, Learning to Fly by Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers is my pairing. Sunday, June 22nd. On this day, not year, roll up, slow down! I've heard from a few listeners that they quite enjoy the more morbid tales from history that occasionally crop up on the podcast. In which case, all I can say is, you want it darker? We kill the flame. What did the crying clown say? Well, give up? The kiddies had been so glad to see their daddy. I wish I could have died with them. This isn't some dark anti-joke. Unfortunately, this was reality for Joe Coyle, a clown employed by the Hagenbeck Wallace Circus. It hadn't been long since he and his 250 circus colleagues had put on their last performance in Michigan City, Indiana. Dazzling crowds with their acrobatics, exotic and wild animals, strongman feats, buffoonish antics, and every other wonder and attraction the circus could bring. But it's all temporary, and after a few nights in one town, they were to pack up and onwards to the next show. It wasn't easy transporting a circus back in 1918. On top of the 250 performers, the circus also needed hundreds of support staff, animal handlers, cooks, people able to set up and take down the big top, etc., etc. The best method for transporting such a troupe? A train. Specifically, as per the New York Times, the Hagenbeck Wallace Circus got around on 4 sleepers, 5 stock cars, 15 flat cars, and a caboose. Although this was just for the human performers. The animals required their own separate train, which on the day prior, June 21st, 1918, had gone on ahead of the humans. The 4 sleeper cars, attached at the end, furthest from the front and the noisy engine, had at one stage been quite luxurious. Fine wood, lit by oil lamps. Although they had been outdated by the arrival of steel sleepers, the circus hadn't replaced them. A deadly mistake. As the train was speeding along towards Hammond, Indiana, a little before 4 a.m., a problem was noticed by an engineer. One of the axles on the train was heating up too much. While they weren't far from Hammond, it was thought it would be best to stop now and fix it. This isn't as simple as with cars today. Noticing a problem, pulling off the road and checking. Trains were very much fixed in place. So an engineer had to be sent back along the tracks to activate warning fuses for any trains following along behind, giving them time to slow down and brake. So, with many of the performers still asleep in the last 4 cars, the engineers got to work on the stopped train. When 4 a.m. hit, and so did the 462 Pacific Troop Transport train carrying 20 empty sleeper cars. The driver, Alonzo Sargent, had missed all the warning signs, hadn't spotted the crew along the tracks waving lanterns, or heard those yelling up at him. It had been just like the Russian cruiser disaster from episode 21. All the bystanders could do was watch on in horror. Unlike with the Alexander Suvorov, we know how Alonzo missed all these signs, as, miraculously, he survived to tell his story. He had been at the end of a long shift, had eaten well throughout the day, was sitting comfortably in his warm, cosy cabin, and had been popping kidney pills, at the time full of poisons and narcotics. All this, combined with the clickety-clack of the wheels on the track, sent Alonzo rocking, rolling, riding, and falling fast asleep. While Alonzo was jolted awake in the crash, not everyone was as lucky. The circus train had stopped on a straight stretch of track, which allowed the 462 to build up a good amount of speed and momentum, crashing into the caboose and 4 wooden sleeper cars at an estimated top speed of 35 miles or 56 kilometers per hour. The large engine tore through the wooden cars, waking up all who weren't immediately killed in the collision. Henry Miller, assistant night manager, survived the impact, recounting, "I was in the last coach next to the caboose and was asleep when we were hit. I woke to the sound of splintering wood. Then there was another crash, and another, and another. The train buckled on itself. It parted in the center, as clean as though it had been sliced with a giant knife." Others, like Clown Joe Coyle's family, weren't as lucky. This disaster wasn't over just yet, however. Do you remember how these sleeper cars were lit? With oil lamps. Oil lamps that had just broken open in the impact, spreading oil over the splintered remains of the car. It wasn't long before they were all engulfed. Survivors fleeing the wreck, facing the harsh reality of leaving those behind who had survived the initial impact, but were now pinned or trapped by debris. One woman, trapped, shouted her would-be rescuers to flee as the flames closed in. Get away quick, or you'll be burned too." Residents and firefighters from nearby towns rushed to help, as did those who had been woken by the noise of the crash nearby. While the flames were eventually extinguished, so too were the lives of 86 individuals, with many more injured or maimed in the wreck. But, as the saying goes, the show must go on. 3 days later, after 2 cancelled performances, the circus was back in action, numbers bolstered by performers from other shows, lending their expertise to the hurting circus. Alonzo, having fled the scene, attempting to make his way back home, had been caught and tried for the collision and death. However, the jury was deadlocked, and eventually all charges were dismissed. Rather than ending on that injustice, let's hear one last story from the Hagen-Beck-Wallace circus from years later. They had acquired a new animal performer, a Russian woman who worked with lions, tigers, and bears. Insert your own "oh my" here. This wasn't the only thing special about her, however. She also had a rather famous father. To quote Boney M., he was big and strong, in his eyes a flaming glow. Most people look at him with terror and with fear, but to Moscow chicks he was such a lovely dear. Yes, Rasputin's daughter, Maria Rasputin, went on to work in the circus. She may have inherited some of her father's legendary stamina for life too, as in 1935, headlines read out, "Mad Monk's daughter maimed by bear." During a show at Pern, Indiana, the performing bear, trained to roll over, struck Maria, knocking her over, and began clawing and biting at her. The bear was dragged away, no Harambe repeat here, and Maria required stitches to close wounds on her arms and legs, but otherwise recovered. Keeping it rather on the nose, the big red nose, for this song pairing, The Tears of a Clown by Smokey Robinson and the Miracles. Which brings us neatly to the quiz. So, pens and papers at the ready, and let us start off with Question 1, Monday. How many survived the Tonquin's journey? Question 2 for Tuesday. What was Frank Nash's nickname? Question 3 for Wednesday. What was the last message received from the Titan? Question 4 for Thursday. How much did it cost to watch a movie at the early Nickelodeon theatres? Question 5 for Friday. What was one of the 3 alternative titles for Jaws that I mentioned? Question 6 for Saturday. How many jumps did Tiny Broadwick perform in her lifetime? And finally, question 7 for Sunday. Who was the famous father of the animal trainer mauled by a bear that the circus employed? Right. If you need to go back to hear those questions again, feel free to do so. But if you've got something down, here are the answers. Answer 1 for Monday. How many survived the Tonquin's journey? Just 1. Answer 2 for Tuesday. Frank Nash was nicknamed Jelly Bean or Jelly. The first for his style, the second for his explosive safecracking. Answer 3 for Wednesday. The final message from Titan was 2 weights dropped. Received just after the support vessel heard what would later be identified as the implosion of the sub. Answer 4 for Thursday. How much did it cost to watch a movie at a Nickelodeon? A nickel. Answer 5 for Friday. 3 of the Jaws alternate titles were The Stillness in the Water, Leviathan Rising, and What's That Thing Noshing on My Leg? Answer 6 for Saturday. Tiny Broadwick performed over 1,100 parachute jumps. And answer 7 for Sunday. The famous father of the animal trainer was Rasputin, lover of the Russian queen. Which brings us to the end of another episode of TDNY. This day, not year. Hopefully the stories were either just the right amount of morbid for you, or not too morbid to keep you from finishing them. I hope you also learned something new from all this. It was fascinating to me, during the research, how topical 2 of the stories still were. Jaws and the Titan, ironically, coming up with new stories even today. As ever, if you have enjoyed what you've listened to, and are feeling particularly extroverted today, I'd love if you could share this podcast with friends, family, colleagues, anyone you think may enjoy my particular takes on history, as each new listener really helps the podcast grow. If sharing isn't your particular form of caring, I'd also be very appreciative if you could rate the podcast on your listener of choice. If you need to get in contact with me over anything, I can be reached on thisdaynotyear@gmail.com once I fight through the spam filters. I would say join me again next week for June 23rd to June 29th, but if you're listening to this on the week I upload, you may have noticed the upload days have been getting progressively later and later in the week. That's because I have to do all the research, writing, recording, and editing around my main job, and, whenever I can snatch a few free moments from life. Evidently, those moments are coming fewer and fewer. So while the podcast will continue, the next episode will be June 30th to July 6th, hopefully giving me some time to get ahead again. So, with the admin over, all I have left to say is that you'll hear from me again soon, and until then, I hope you have an historic week. Bye.